a key component of the Yetzias Mitzrayim, the Exodus from Egypt, was that they would leave Berechush Gadol, with tremendous wealth. And that's something that had to satisfy the expectations of Avraham Avinu. The question is, why is it such a central theme? And what part of it is necessary to satisfy Avraham Avinu's expectations? Oifen Pasuk, the Pasuk tells us on Asatis Chenam that the Eibishter promises Moshe Rabbeinu that the Yidden will find favor in the eyes of the Egyptians, and therefore they'll give them all of this wealth. Which is part of the message that the Eibishter told Moshe Rabbeinu when he told him about the Exodus. So there's a Medrash, and later we're going to see there's a Gemara which is very similar. The Medrash tells us on Asatis Chenam, why is it necessary to say that I will give favor, that the Jewish people will find favor in the eyes of the Egyptians? Says the Medrash, I promised Avraham Avinu that after the years of being strangers in a foreign land and being slaves, they're going to leave with tremendous wealth. And he said, so I'm going to do it in such a way that they find grace and favor in the eyes of the Mitzrim, in order that they will lend them all of their resources, and therefore the Jews will leave Egypt filled with assets. Why is that so important? That Avraham Avinu should not have an excuse to open his mouth and say, you fulfilled, Eibishter, the part that you promised me, that they'll be slaves and that they'll be treated badly. But you didn't fulfill the part of the promise, which was that afterwards they would leave with tremendous wealth. So, what is the Medrash trying to clarify by telling us, Masha? It's pretty obvious what the Medrash means when it says that the Eibishter promised Avraham Avinu that they're going to leave with tremendous wealth, meaning, because you could ask a very obvious question. How come it is that the Eibishter immediately, even before Moshe Rabbeinu agrees to the role of taking the Jews out of Mitzrayim, and before Moshe Rabbeinu leaves Midian to go physically to Mitzrayim, already now renting mit Moshe wegen Yetzias Mitzrayim gesagt, as on a satis now at the burning bush, the Eibush is already telling Moshe Rabbeinu that the Mitzrayim will look favorably towards the Jewish people. Fine for the Medrash. So the Medrash explains why that is necessary to be discussed now. As the mid for gemeint an iket naivos meglich die Yetziah. It's because here the Eibush is telling Moshe how they're going to get out of Mitzrayim, and a core requirement in order to get out of Mitzrayim is that before they get out of Mitzrayim, they have to fulfill the promise that the Eibush made to Avraham Avinu that there'd be tremendous wealth, and therefore they're going to have to approach their neighbors, and therefore they're going to have to be seen favorably by the Egyptians. In order to satisfy the condition that was included in the original covenant that spoke about the exile in Egypt, which was given to Avraham Avinu right at the beginning, the Eibush said, so we've got to ensure that that is built into the Yetzias Mitzrayim. That makes sense. What doesn't make sense is, what we have to understand is, what's the Medrash saying in order that Avraham Avinu doesn't have a complaint? Surely there's a bigger issue at stake over here. Why are we worried about Avraham Avinu having a complaint? Surely the bigger issue is, the Eibush made a promise, the Eibush has to keep that promise. Surely that should be the focus. So as mentioned, dem selben Ihnen, as das, was Ihnen haben gedarf, scheel sein von dem Mitzvim, Klechesav Gomer, is gedarf Rom, soll nicht haben die Teine, Vavodim Kiem, Vachechen Yetzirach Godoloi Kiem. This principle that the Yidden had to get this wealth from the Egyptians in order that Avraham Avinu should not be able to say, but you only fulfilled part of the promise about slavery and not the part about wealth. So this discussion, Gemara Brachas, is also brought in the Gemara. But dort is moving the Neutigkeits of Avodim die Teine von Avram. But there, the Gemara explains why it's important to address the possible complaint that Avraham Avinu would have. So, the Gemara stellt sich auf in Pasuk in Parashas Boy. There, the Gemara is discussing not like here, the Eibush telling Moshe Rabbeinu what's going to happen, but rather when it actually happens in Parashas Boy, where Moshe Rabbeinu addresses the Jewish people and he tells them, Daber no, please. The Eibush tells Moshe Rabbeinu, please speak in the ears of the people, and remind them that they've got to go and they've got to ask their neighbors for all of this wealth. So the context over there is the Eibush asking Moshe to ask the Eden to ask their neighbors for their wealth on his masber. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Yana teaches us that no is an expression of bakosha. I'm requesting something. The Eibishter says to Moshe in the Gemara's version, I'm asking you, almost begging you, go tell the Jewish people that you should ask and almost beg of them that to ask the Egyptians for the gold and silver vessels. Says the Gemara, in order that tzaddik, who is unnamed in the Gemara, Rashi tells us it's Avram Avinu, that he shouldn't say that the Eibishter fulfilled the part of the slavery, did not fulfill the part of the wealth. Thus says, in other words, the Gemara is coming from a different angle. The Gemara is coming from the angle, why did the Eibishter have to request of Moshe, to request of the Yidden, with the language of no, which is an expression of bakosha? That's what the Gemara is fixating on. That they should request the gold and silver from the Egyptians. When you think about it, says the Gemara, do you honestly think that that's what the Jews were concerned with at that particular point in time? But the Gemara does, like the Gemara itself says, the Jews said to Moshe Rabbeinu, forget the gold and silver. We'd be very happy if we could have this impossible situation of actually getting out physically. So the Gemara explains that even though the Jews said to Moshe, leave the wealth, just get us out of here, the Eibishter could not honor that request because he doesn't want Avram Avinu to complain that only half of the undertaking and the promise was fulfilled and they didn't get the wealth. But the Medrash is not focusing on the word no. Here in the Medrash we're discussing the Eibishter speaking to Moshe at the burning bush, not Moshe being told to get the Yidden to request the gold and silver. Now, meaning our Medrash over here in our pasuk is discussing what the Eibishter is going to do to fulfill his promise to Avram Avinu. I'm going to make you favorable in the eyes of the Egyptians. So why in this context do we have to say, well, the reason the Eibishter has to fulfill his promise is so Avram Avinu doesn't have a complaint? No, the reason the Eibishter has to fulfill his promise is because the Eibishter made a promise. Now, before we discuss that, there's some nuances in the language that we also have to examine, which are going to be relevant to the answer. So let's look at these nuances in language, both in the Medrash and in the Gemara. Aleph. How come both the Medrash and the Gemara use what seems to be an unnecessary expression? Kiyem bohem. You kept the part of slavery with them. Loi kiyem bohem. But there's the possibility that you're not going to keep the part of giving them wealth with them. Surely the smoother way to say it would be to say, Avraham Avinu is going to complain, you fulfilled the fact that you were going to make them slaves. You did not fulfill the fact that you were going to give them wealth. Who needs the word bohem, that you didn't fulfill it with them? Why is that relevant? Question 2, base. Why is it that you have to say you need Eibishter to fulfill the part of giving them wealth because you fulfilled the part of promising that they'd be slaves? Surely the whole complaint is you promise them that they're going to come out of Egypt with wealth. Surely that's the complaint. You didn't do that, rather than saying you kept the other part. Surely the point is you promised them wealth and you haven't given it. And lastly, Gimel, what's the time for them Shina al Shenis and Medrash and Gemara? How come the Medrash and the Gemara, which seem to be saying the same thing, use different language, and some of that language is quite stark? In Medrash stage, the Medrash says we don't want to open a possibility of Avram Avinu being able to complain. On in Gemara, as Aleph Shelo Yoimar, just keeps it very generic that he shouldn't say, not Pischem Peh, that he shouldn't have a complaint, and base Oisei Tzaddik, that Tzaddik, without naming who it is. Especially when you consider the Medrash already told us who we're talking about over here, where it says, Avram, that the Eibishter says, what I told Avram Avinu that I'm going to do X and Y is now being fulfilled. So it would appear that the Medrash did not have to say Avram Avinu again, that Avram Avinu is going to have a complaint. Mashenkein in Gemara wird Avram kal nit demont, whereas the Gemara doesn't mention Avram by name at all. Und doch nutzt die Gemara dem Torah tzaddik und nit Avram Avinu, and it just keeps the generic term that tzaddik without telling us which tzaddik it is. So, wenn wir das verstehen, bei Hektim, in order to understand that, we have to be clear that whatever the Eibishter says is going to happen, that's for sure. The Eibishter darf mit keinem sein, die Avtocha machen, was Avtocha atzmo. There's no question. The reason that the Eibishter has to fulfill his promise is because the Eibishter made a promise. You and I have to fulfill our promises. How much more so the Eibishter? Weil hat zugesagt, because the Eibishter made this undertaking. Warum siehst doch, lo ishkel v'chazev, as the Pasuk says, the Eibishter is not like a human who, God forbid, lies. Is it possible that the Eibishter should say something and not do it and not uphold it? Or as the Pasuk says, that the Eibishter doesn't desecrate his covenant and he doesn't change his words. That's the reason the Eibishter has to keep his promise, because he's the Eibishter and because it's a promise. The reason that the Eibishter has to keep his promise surely is not only to satisfy a potential complaint from Avram Avinu. There's something much more fundamental over here. That clarifies for us. Obviously, the implication over here is that the Eibishter had many different ways besides making the Jews have favor in the eyes of the Egyptians. There are many other ways that he could have given them great wealth when they left, and that would have fulfilled his Haftacha, his promise, which was great wealth. Und von deswegen wird seine Notfall der Teil von Avram Avinu. And yet, if the Eibishter had used one of these other methods to fill the Jews with wealth, Avram Avinu could have still had a complaint. The question is, why would he still have had a complaint? Und das ist der Medrash Mechadish. That's what the Medrash is telling us. Dafke durch dem, was die Avtocha wird ausgeführt in der Meifern von Osati, Eschena, als Beine Mitzrayim begomer, it's only if the method that the Eibishter uses to deliver wealth to the Jews is in such a way that the Egyptians look at them favorably, only then only then would Avram Avinu have no issues and no complaints. Und in dem Chiddush is the Gemara Moisif Nachmer. Once the Medrash has told us that, which is, it's not good enough just to line them with gold and silver, but it has to be done in such a way that the Egyptians look at them favorably, then the Gemara adds more in detail to this. This concept that they have to find favor in the eyes of the Egyptians so that the Egyptians will fill them up with all these assets is noch nicht in ganzem Aspekt. Even that, says the Gemara, won't be good enough. Es hot gedav deinen an öfen von daber no beazne ha'am v'yish'olu gomer. It's not good enough that the Egyptians should look favorably at the Yidden. A key component over here is that the Yidden should actually ask them for this wealth. Eden sollen betten das bei den Mitzrim. The Jews have to request it. Was damit wird den ganzen nicht sein kann, mokem zu Tainas Avram Avinu, and then Avram has no complaints. Now the question is why? Why are these important components? Surely the Eibishter promised wealth, they're getting wealth. Who cares how they get it? Why is the Medrash saying no, it has to be in such a way that the Egyptians see them favorably? And the Gemara adds more than that, they actually have to ask for it. The reason is the Birbozeh. The Gemara itself in Masechta Sanhedrin, the Gemara tells a famous story in Sanhedrin as Bisman Alexander Smokdun, at the time of Alexander the Great. The Egyptians of that time came to Alexander with a complaint against the Jewish people. They said, look, the deal was that we're going to lend you gold and silver so that you'd go out and serve your God in the desert for 3 days, and they never came back and they never returned any of that gold and silver, and we want it back, and probably with interest as well. I'll say Gevir ben Pesisa again for it. So the Gemara famously says nobody wanted to take the case, and Gevir ben Pesisa, who was a hunchback, said, I'll take it on. What's the worst that can happen? If I lose, they'll say a hunchback lost, and if I win, obviously it's good for the Jewish people. And his explanation was, forget about the fact that we should potentially return gold and silver to you. Actually, you need to calculate the wages of 600,000 Jewish people over the period of 210 years with compound interest, and you have to pay that back to us. And at that point, the Egyptians fled. So the Mefarshim explains something fascinating based on this. That the wealth the Egyptians gave the Jewish people when they left Egypt was not simply the fulfillment of a divine edict, but it was actually payment for the work that they had contributed to the Egyptian cause. Now this is going to get us into a very important part of this conversation. On the one hand, it was a punishment for the Egyptians. You enslaved the Jewish people, now it's going to cost you. On Sayal Sashim Schar Faradidin, as well as the fact that it was also the Jews deserved payment for all of the work that they did. Now, there are two possible ways that the payment at that time could have happened. We're going to explore both of those ways, and that's going to be the thrust of what the Sikha is all about. What's the main thing? Is the payment primarily to reward the Jewish people and compensate them for their slavery, or is it primarily to punish the Egyptians and drain their financial resources? So Aleph, one possibility is, the reason that the Egyptians had to now give all this wealth to the Jewish people is was a punishment for them because they mistreated the Jewish people. And then you would lock it into the pasuk that the Eibishter said to Avraham Avinu at the covenant of Bris Ben Absarim, I'm going to judge the nation who subjugates them, and therefore, straight after, they're going to leave with great wealth, meaning, that implies that part of the reason, or part of the way in which Hashem judges and punishes the perpetrators is making them pay a lot of money to the Jewish people. That means this approach illustrates that the main thing we had to achieve at this point was to punish and therefore empty the coffers of Egypt. Now, why didn't they just have some kind of a major recession or depression? Why did the money have to go to the Jews? Because practically the Jews are the ones who worked for the Egyptians. Therefore, they designed the way in which the Egyptians would be punished, that money that would suck the life out of Egypt should go to the Jewish people who are the most deserving recipients because they had been abused by the Egyptians. That's one possibility. The other possibility is the exact opposite. Base. As the reason that we're talking money and wealth over here is because the Jews had been enslaved and they deserve to be compensated. So how come their wealth is a continuation of the conversation of judging and punishing the Egyptians? Is weil zusammen mit den Schar Avoida for the Eden is das echt gewesen ein Shalom for the Mitzvah, because the way that the Eibishter structured the kind of compensation the Jews would get is that it would come at a cost to the Egyptians. It was this tremendous draining of their resources to the extent actually that they were completely depleted. So the question is, which is the focus? And the difference is, the Chelek zwischen die zwei Fanim is that it's going to make a big difference about how we understand the whole process. If the main goal is to punish the Egyptians, then it makes no difference how the money is transferred from the Egyptians to the Jews. Fact is, Egyptians are losing money. That's what counts as being punished. And so it happens the Jews deserve to get it. They get it. Die Sache ist, as der Rechush Gadol soll zugenommen werden von Mitzrayim, the focus is take away the wealth from the Egyptians. And das, was es kommt zu Eden, is by seinen Tzedadi, and the fact that the recipients end up being the Jewish people, that's a side issue. It's manaf gemine dürfen, but say, who cares how that side issue is fulfilled? Over Meile, wenn die Eden wollten dem Rechush Gadol zugenommen von dem Mitzrayim B'shas Makas Shishler Dugma. So let's say, for argument's sake, it was in the plague of darkness, and instead of checking out what assets the Egyptians had the Jews actually taken those assets? What's the Chuf getan? Great. Everything's fine. We've achieved Rechush Gadol. We took money and wealth away from the Egyptians. It got into the hands of the Jews. Shalom al Yisrael, everybody's happy. But if you take the other approach, which is primarily the reason that the Jews have to be enriched is because they deserve to be compensated for the work that they did as slaves, because they were subjugated and abused, then the methodology has to look like payment. If you're claiming it's a payment for work done, then it's got to look like payment for work done. And it has to be very clear and tangible that the Egyptians are giving this wealth to the Jews. They're paying for the work that was done. It's got to look like a payment. Und das ist, was der Medrash sagt. That's the angle of the Medrash. That the Eibishter has to make sure not only that money lands up in Jewish pockets, but rather that the Egyptians look favorably at the Jewish people. And then then Avraham Avinu won't have a complaint. You made them slaves, but you didn't fulfill the wealth element. Because the wealth element is not just supposed to be a bottom line in the bank account. The Medrash is telling us that the Eibishter's promise that the Jews would leave with tremendous wealth, which at the time, the Eibishter doesn't spell out exactly what that looks like. It is possible that this could be fulfilled by highlighting the punishment of the Egyptians, they're losing all of this money, and not necessarily the gain of the Jewish people. And that would be fine from the Eibishter's perspective. He fulfilled his promise. I promised you wealth, you got the wealth. But Avram Avinu, who cares about us, would not be satisfied with that. Avram, the Ov von Am Yisrael, Avram Avinu, who is the father of the Jewish nation, Mont as the Mechuven from the Rechush Gadol, so sein Beikele Tovas Yisrael, wants to ensure that the way the Rechush Gadol happens is primarily to the benefit of the Jewish people. They should feel that we are now being compensated for the work that we did and the suffering that we underwent. And only then would it be some level of consolation for everything that they had been through for 210 years of slavery. Dermit is moving favos the pischem peh von Avram as vachachin chule lokiim bohem. That's why Avram Avinu's potential complaint that you fulfilled the slavery but not so much the giving of the wealth is verbunden mit der Hagdama von vavodum ve'inoisim kiyim bohem, has to first be against the context of you fulfilled the part of making them slaves. Now, it's not good enough just to give them money. You have to fulfill the part of them feeling that they were consoled or compensated for it. And that's also that's also the nuance over here of saying that the Eibishter fulfilled the part of them being slaves. The Jewish people experienced this difficulty and slavery. If that's the case, then the wealth that comes to them has to feel like it's something that was fulfilled for them, that was in their interest. And that's why the Medrash and the Gemara stick in the word bohem. It's not good enough just to fulfill the promise that you made. It has to be fulfilled in a way that it's bohem, it's in their interest. When the Jewish people get this gold and silver, they have to feel that this was something that the Eibishter had originally promised to them and for them, for their benefit, as a reward for the tremendous effort that they put in. So how do you address Avram Avinu's complaint, which is, I need my children to feel that they were cared about, that they were compensated, that they're not just arriving on the other end with money. How do you do that? The Egyptians have to give it to them with grace. They have to give it willingly and happily. That they should find favor. Because then it will be very clear that the reason they're getting all of this wealth is because of and to compensate for the terrible slavery that they experienced. That's the Medrash position. Avram Avinu is not going to be satisfied that you just fulfilled your promise. It's got to feel like a promise to them for their benefit. The Gemara takes it further. The Gemara adds another layer. And the way that the Gemara illustrates its additional perspective is by commenting specifically on when the Eibishter tells Moshe to tell the Yidden to get the wealth from Egypt. Because let's go with what the Medrash required, which is that the Egyptians hand over their assets happily to the Jewish people, which is great. And you could still complain. How do I know that that is a compensation for the slavery? Maybe it's just because the Egyptians are at this particular point in time feeling favorable towards the Jewish people. It could be that it's not related to the work that they did. It's just gifts that the Egyptians are giving to them because, for whatever reason, their attitude has brightened up. Maybe they just have a little bit of concern that the Jews should not leave Egypt completely empty and empty-handed. Und darüber. Therefore, the Gemara says, in order to be absolutely certain that the wealth that they're getting is part of the Abish's promise to them in their interest as compensation for their experience. As was all wissen, that you should have absolutely no doubt that this is reward for the work that they had done. Therefore, the Abisha says it's not good enough just to make the Egyptians smile and hand over their gold. You've actually got to ask for it, because then it's transactional, then it fits into a worker requesting his wages. When I ask for it, and you give it to me with a happy face, that shows that you acknowledge that I deserve these assets, which is what the Eibishter wants to achieve. Which helps us to understand the difference in language usage in the Gemara versus the Medrash. It says that he shouldn't say, not that he shouldn't have a complaint. It's not even a complaint. The complaint has been satisfied the minute that they are giving it to them. And that tzaddik, emphasis on the word tzaddik rather than the persona of Avram Avinu. Why? Let's just assume that the Egyptians came over and of their own accord laid it on thick and gave all of this gold and silver to the Jewish people. That would indicate that obviously this belongs to the Jewish people, because the Egyptians are quite happy to give it. And obviously the reason that this is all happening is because the Eibishter has orchestrated it for the benefit of the Jewish people, which is great, satisfies Avram Avinu's potential complaints. And therefore, Avram Avinu is not going to say anything. In other words, or to say that the Egyptians, if they don't hand over the assets, will cause Avram Avinu to open his mouth. That you didn't fulfill the kiyam ba'hem, giving them wealth for their benefit. That's been done. Check that box. But the Gemara says there's more to the story. It's not just that Avram Avinu should feel satisfied that his children are getting compensated as they deserve to be. But say tzaddik, what's the point of a tzaddik? Tzaddik implies somebody who is focused on justice and doing things in the most upright manner, which Avram Avinu did. You could still, from a perspective of absolute objective justice, you could say, look at the tremendous pain that the Eibishter made for them through the slavery. Kommt die ihnen zu, werden bezahlt mit Rechush Gadol in ein Ofen, sollen sein Nika begol as Sischar Avidosam. They deserve to now be rewarded in such a way that it is clear that this is the compensation for the work done. Because when you can see that they're getting this wealth as payment for the slavery that they endured, that's when you can say Kiyem Bohem, that the Eibishter did this with their interests in mind. Das wird aufgetan genau durch dem, was da bei uns nicht haben, wie ich alle gehen. The way you achieve that is, they ask, we want our payment, and the Mitzvah say, happily, here you have it, because you deserve it. Now that has an impact on our spiritual service of the Eibishter. The Bir Bozeh Ba'avodah Ruchnis. Says, you do ask the Rechush Gadol, was in haben ausgenommen from Mitzrayim. We know very well that the great wealth the Jews took out of Egypt. Besteht bei Pnimis Unionen von den Nitzeitze Kedusha, welche seinen Gewinn dort. We know that it wasn't just about gold and silver, but much more importantly, about the spirituality, the holiness that was embedded within those physical items. Kelel, in them including the gold and silver that they physically took out, which were later turned into holy items. They used this gold and silver to build the Mishkan. Think about that. Egyptian gold was used to build the Mishkan and other forms of Kedusha. So the experience of 210 years of Egyptian slavery allowed them the opportunity to refine and elevate all of the holiness that was deep, deep embedded in Mitzrayim. Die Kavona Tachlis von sehr durchmachen dem Golus Mitzrayim ist gewähnt, so the whole reason they endured this Golus in Mitzrayim was not Chas v'Shalom as a punishment. It was so that they should be able to transform all of the potential holiness into actual holiness. To extract and elevate the deeply buried sparks of holiness that were living in Mitzrayim. Which also answers a big question. If the Jews were happy to turn around to the Eibush and say, you know what, leave all the wealth, just get us out of here. The Gemara tells us, right? Where they say, we'd just be happy to survive and get out alive. Like the Gemara brings the mashal of a prisoner, where the prisoner says, I'd rather just commute my sentence instead of waiting for some kind of wealth. So why didn't the Eibush listen? The Yidden are saying, skip the wealth and take us out. Well, once you look at it from the perspective that they're elevating the holiness that's embedded in Mitzrayim, then it all makes sense, because there's no point to the exercise until you've elevated those sparks of holiness. The Rechush God is given an Iker Tzvek from Golus Mitzrayim. The primary reason why they're in Golus Mitzrayim in the first place is to access these holy sparks and get them out of there. If the Jews Chas v'Shana would have left Egypt without having achieved this objective, all they would have had to show for it was pain and no greatness, no transformation. But because they were slaves and they engaged with Egypt and they transformed Egypt into something that exuded holiness, not only did they achieve the goal of this particular mission, but they were exponentially upgraded to become a completely different kind of human to any other human on earth. That's the deeper meaning of what it means, that afterwards they would go out with great wealth. Remember, before they went down into Mitzrayim, the Eibush told Yaakov Avinu, I'm going to go down with you into Mitzrayim, and then I will take you up again afterwards, implying not just that the Eibush would rescue the Jews out of Egypt, which is true, but much more than that, you would be much elevated through the experience, and that's the point over here. It doesn't help to say we can skip the wealth, because then you don't have the elevation, which was the point of the exercise. So now we've said the two possibilities. Is the focus that you're punishing Egypt and it's also to the benefit of the Jews? Or is the focus that you're rewarding the Jews and it also costs Egypt? Both of those perspectives are relevant to this spiritual analysis. The first attitude we took was that the primary goal of Rechush Gadol was to punish the Egyptians and drain their finances. The goal is to punish Egypt. That would imply that the main reason the Jews were in Golus was to help Egypt to rehabilitate. That Egypt and its holy sparks should be refined. Now, who's going to make this happen? It would be the Jewish people. Therefore, they deserve something as a reward for doing this tremendous avoida of elevating sparks within Egypt. And what's their reward? That as a result of their avoida, they get this exponential growth and elevation that happens afterwards. Avram Avinu But Avram Avinu looks at it completely different, and he says the Rechush Gadol, this exercise, the Yerida into Golus, is all for the benefit of Jews. That's the most important thing. As the Mechuben von Golus Mitzrayim is Kedei Eden sollte Grechen sehr aliyah shleimus. Why is there Golus Mitzrayim? So that the Jews should get to their highest, most perfect state. Und erfahr hat der Eibishter Arab geschickt in Mitzrayim, so bevor sein dort in Zetze Kedusha. That's why the Eibishter took the Yidden down into such a dark place like Mitzrayim, in order that they should find the Netzetzes of Kedusha, bichdei durch dem zu degreichen sehr schlimmes, which would help the Jews achieve their spiritual completion. Das heißt, im Mechuven und die Teles Valier von Yidden. In other words, the whole purpose of this exercise is elevate the Yidden exponentially. Now, but the practical way to do it is you've got to engage Mitzrayim and get the holiness out of Mitzrayim. That's why Avram Avinu says it's not good enough just to fix Mitzrayim. It's not good enough just to get Nitzotzes of Kedusha out of Mitzrayim. It's got to be that the Jews are full, that it's been presented to them with favor. When the Egyptians are handing over their stuff to the Jews, rather than the Jews stealing or taking their stuff, stealing is the wrong word, taking their stuff, then it's very clear. What is the purpose of this exercise? For the benefit of the Jewish people. How do you see it? Because look, that world that was so dark is now assisting the Jews to achieve their objective. Those sparks of holiness embedded in Mitzrayim are helping the Jewish people to achieve what the Jewish people have to achieve, which is the primary focus. Like the Pasuk says in Tinim, that the Eibishter is there with those in the plural who help me, L'shein Rabim. Chassidus explains that what that means is those sparks of holiness that we extract through engaging the world and serving Hashem within this world, they become the assistance to me serving the Eibishter to be able to do what I'm supposed to do, which is happening in Mitzrayim over here. That Mitzrayim is now assisting the Jewish people to achieve their goal and objective. Mitzrayim is completely secondary. Now the fact that these sparks of holiness become the assistants to the Mevareh, the one who's engaging the world, transforming the world, is well, that's because the whole goal of engaging the world and elevating sparks is for the benefit of the Jewish people. Therefore, those sparks will assist the Jewish people in order that the Jewish people should be elevated. So, die zwei Anal zanich faran in the Avodah von jeder Eden. This is not only something that was relevant at that time, it's relevant to each of us and our neshama's experience here on earth. Because as we well know, the neshama living in this world is very much in a state of golus, and the goal is, of course, to elevate it. The reason the neshama enters this world is to be able to refine and impact and elevate the body, the world in which we find ourselves, the Kasham Liachtem Ber and Seit Baruch Hu, to link and connect them, unify them with Eibishter's infinite self, which then transforms this world into the Eibishter's divine home. So you bring a neshama down into this world. It engages with the world in order to elevate the world. That is not only an elevation for the world, it's Yerida, the neshama descending into this world, tzarech aliyah, for the benefit of the elevation of the neshama. Wird in ihr aufgetan an aliyah noch hecher, wie sie es gewinnt könnte, Yeridas lemata. The neshama is elevated to a platform, a level higher and greater than it was before it entered this world. Eventually allowing the neshama to achieve its absolute completion. Und in dem Sinne Franz face for us, der Chanal ben get to Golus Mitzrayim in the same way as we saw two approaches to understanding the goal of Golus Mitzrayim, the two different views of how we should understand our impact on this world. Aleph, one is as the Ikav Tachlis is as Velds on the Sparvern and Vern Adir Lo Yisparach. You could say the whole purpose is change the world, impact the world. But who's going to change the world? It will be us as Jewish people. Comes at the Farashar, so we deserve something in return. We deserve to emerge with tremendous wealth or elevation. So the neshama enters this world. Goal of the neshama is to change the world. Benefit is the neshama gets elevated. Or we could say, Beis, the Tachlis HaKavono is Eden. The primary focus is the Jew. The world is just a means to an end. The goal is that we reach our perfection. Now the Weg dazu is, how do we get that? The neshama has to enter this world, and has to engage the world and transform the world. But the goal is the elevation of self. Self meaning the neshama. So die zwei Eufanim anal seinen verbunden mit zwei Eufanim wie eine Neshama geht zu ihrer Avodah von Bir v'Zikach ha'olam. Depending on which perspective you take, could reflect two different ways of how the Neshama goes about changing and elevating the world. Aleph, die Avodah b'Bir ha'olam is mit Kabbalah Sel v'anevet poshet. Well, one way is, this is what I got to do. The Eibishter says I got to change the world. I got to change the world. I'm a simple servant. Whatever the Eibishter says, I do. Da says, as farem es kenef nafkaminit vos die Avodah tutuf. In other words, it's not for me. It's about my pay grade to understand what the results of the avodah will be. I just have to do what I'm told to do. I'm conscious of one thing, which is shlichus from the Meibishter. Person has a shlichus, they have to fulfill the shlichus. That's all they care about. Es ist bei mir aber nicht mehr schane, was die Schlichus tutuf. Doesn't make a difference what the Schlichus is going to achieve. But how you do it, like the expression that the Alter Rebbe introduces to us, at the head the Eibusher told us to chop wood, we chop wood. What did das getan mit derselbe Kabbalah Salah? Do it with the same commitment. Or there's another approach, yes, of course, I'm doing whatever the Eibusher wants with complete submission and acceptance of Hashem's authority. But besides and over and above that, I also understand the value and the purpose and the goal of the Savoida. Why I'm the Eibusher's representative? Because I'm trying to turn this world into Hashem's home. I'm conscious of that. Depending on which approach you take will determine what the process is of the neshama being elevated, which would be achieved through those efforts. If a person approaches out of absolute Kabbalah soul, I'm just here to do what the Eibusher wants. I have one goal: fulfill the Eibusher's shlichus. Well, then there's the Eibusher's shlichus, which I'm doing, and then the benefit afterwards that the neshama gets elevated. It's like a reward that I get for work done. After I fulfill what the Eibusher wants, then I get something in return. But when I'm completely dedicated to the Eibusher and sensitive to what the Eibusher wants to achieve, then whatever I achieve through my avodah, which is the bonding of this world with Elikus, which turns this world into Hashem's home, then it's not like I finish my avodah and then I get rewarded afterwards. It's all part and parcel of the avodah. Because what is the elevation of my neshama? Doing this. As the Amshachas Atzmus, was wird aufgetan durch ihre Avodah bebir v'zikach ha'olam, the Direl Atzmus Yisbarach, that the world should be elevated and transformed and become Hashem's home. Wird nesgalet zu den Neshama was wird aufgetan die Dira, me being conscious of the fact that I've done this, that is the Aliyah. It's not an Aliyah, that's something that comes afterwards. Aber der zweite von Avodah kann sein B'shtei, and even that could have two nuances to it. Aleph, as the Teichen und Uftu von seiner Avodah wird bei ihm der Head nicht beschas Avodah Guf und Gemara Avodah. It's possible that a person could do their Avodah and then afterwards become conscious of what they've achieved. Then the person has 20/20 hindsight and could say, I get it. I see what I achieved through all of my efforts. Even while engaged in the work, the head at the person is sensitive to and conscious of what this work is achieving. To the extent that not only am I checking the box of doing what the Eibusher wants, that I'm actually doing, this is me, this is what I care about. I've completely ingested this reality and integrated it into my thinking. My passion, my care, my focus, my everything in life is turning the world into the Eibusher's home. And this is the nuanced difference between the messaging of the Medrash and that of the Gemara. The Gemara, which comes from the perspective which is, let's ensure that great tzaddik who's caring about that which is just and right in the world should not have an issue in the fact that the Jews were not rewarded. So that if you've got to ask of the Mitzrayim, ist das der Fall, weil das Gemara haben ihnen euch beeis wo is man ashibud der Herd as the tachlis avoid as the ruchush god the bir anitzotes. That's because the Gemara is saying that the Jews, while they were in Mitzrayim, were completely conscious of what they were achieving and what the value in that achievement was. And the Rebbe Monen das didn't allein be Gemara avoid. That's why they actually themselves feel confident to demand. We need that reward, because we need those nitzitz of kedusha. As hemshach to the avodah, we've done our avodah. He says the hemshach von the avodah is to become the rechush gadol. We did our avodah. Now we need to get what follows the avodah, which is the rechush gadol. Mashein ken la medrash, whereas the perspective of the medrash is the mechuvah v'tachlis hat sich nicht angehört in the avodah von in b'shas hashibud. As long as the Jewish people were in Golus, They were not yet sensitized to what the benefit and the value of the Golus was. Only when they concluded the Golus and they could look back. Und der Pfarrer ist meist begeistert. Der Kuschgott soll kommen nach Gemara Avoida in einer Öfen von Vayash Ilum, as the Mitzvah allein given us zu jeden Kanal. Therefore, they don't feel the compulsion to say we need those Nitzotzes of Kedusha. When they're given the Nitzotzes of Kedusha from Mitzrayim, they say, aha, we understand what our Avoida was all about. That's a take-home lesson for us. When Kol Anal kommt heraus, in der Avoida von Yadin b'Ma'aseinu v'Avoida Sen goes Ma'meshach HaGolus. This has a lesson for us in all of our Avoida we're supposed to do during the course of Golus in order, obviously, to bring Mashiach. Especially now when we are in the unfolding of Mashiach's arrival. The bread and butter of Judaism is we learn Torah and we do mitzvahs out of dedication to Hashem. That's what Eibusha asked of us. Und so macht nicht keinen Unterschied beträgt aber das klar, was ist die Kavona von der Eibusha Lichus of Avidos. It makes absolutely zero difference why the Eibusha wants me to do this. Over Meila, es bei ihm kein Afkamin, it sees Bisman Beis HaMikdash, or Bisman HaGolos Stam, or the Bikshas in the Mashiachos. Doesn't matter where I am on the timeline. I could be in the Beis HaMikdash with great Giluyim, in the time of the darkest Golos, or on the cusp of Mashiach. The Ifan Hakim is mit ein Kavona v'Tachlis. I do what the Eibusha wants with a singular focus. Ton atzivi ushlichos from the Eibusha. I'm doing what the Eibusha wants. Wissen die Gott aus. Man gewinnt sich wirklich für die Mashiach. Und Tachlis hashlemas hazeh shel yimei Mashiach tchias hameis mishul gilay and so baruch hu b'olam hazeh gashmi. So knowing, however, that we're right there, we're at the finish line, and the entire purpose of the whole of existence, which is to reveal the Eibusha infinitely in this world. Which is why the world was originally created. And that's all tolui b'ma'aseinu v'avodah sen kol zman meshach hagolus is completely dependent on our avodah during the time of Golus. We actually have to be conscious of this. It's not good enough just to have a generic sense of commitment to the Eibusha. We have to be sensitized to the fact of where we are in the timeline and what our impact is going to be. Und wenn man das befeuert, als Said der Herd, als ein Kimater Mitzvahs bringt und es macht der Machishena Bias HaMashiach bin Beis HaMikdash v'chulei. Think about it practically. When a person knows what I'm doing right now is hastening the arrival of Mashiach and the restoration of the Beis HaMikdash and all the other things associated with Mashiach. Das says, als ein Avodah bringt die Welt v'chol sei der Stalshus l'tachlisoi, which means what I'm doing now is bringing the world to its culmination. This is why it was created. That there should be a dwelling for the Eibusha in the lowest realm. Then the way that the person serves the Eibusha is in a whole different way, completely different energy, completely different focus, completely different level of performance. When a person is so invested in their avodah, then their tefillah, their request for Mashiach is so much more alive. We want Mashiach now. To the extent that you actually, so to speak, demand of them, we need, we want, we're lacking. We have to have Mashiach now. Das Gufa is noch maher macht ihm die Gute von Kolechot v'achas Yisrael. That really speeds up the redemption of every single one of us. Zusammen mit Shchinta was gefindt sich begolus, including the Shchina, which is also in a state of exile. Und es wird miyad hein in Nigolen, and then will be immediately redeemed. Yad mamash now ba'gola didan. Literally now, Mashiach should take us out of Golus.